November 22nd, 2025, Johannesburg, the G20 summit is about to begin on African soil for the very first time in history. But there is a problem. The United States, one of the most powerful members of this club, has chosen not to show up, not because of logistics, not because of security concerns, because they're angry. And President Cyril Ramaphosa had one response.
It cannot be that a country's geographical location or income level or army determines who has a voice and who is spoken down to. And it basically means that there should be no bullying of one nation by another nation. We are all equal.
Now, here is what makes this wild. The US didn't just skip the summit, they mocked it. Senior American officials called South Africa's G20 hosting attempt. Basically, G100. Too many guests, too crowded, too messy. But if you think that's the whole story, you are missing the chess match happening underneath, because this argument over a guest list, it's a 140-year-old fight coming to a head. And to understand why South Africa invited 42 countries to this summit and why that terrified certain people, we need to go back to a room in Berlin in 1884, where 14 European powers and the United States sat around a table and carved up an entire continent. And guess how many Africans were in that room? Zero. Nada. Now, let me paint you a picture. Berlin 1884, the Berlin Conference, sometimes called the Scramble for Africa. Now, representatives from Germany, Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, Belgium, even the United States all gathered to negotiate how to divide Africa into neat little colonial territories. And not a single African ruler, not a delegate, not even an observer. Now, the Sultan of Zanzibar tried to send representatives. That request was rejected brutally. They drew borders through kingdoms, split ethnic groups down the middle, handed out land like party favors, and the people who actually lived there, they weren't consulted. Now, I know what you are thinking right now. That was over a century ago. Things have changed. Now, fast forward to 1945, the United Nations is founded. The Security Council, the most powerful body in global governance, gets 5 permanent members with veto power. The United States, the Soviet Union, later Russia, China, France, the United Kingdom. Notice anything? Africa, with 1.4 billion people today, projected to hit 2.5 billion by 2050, has 0 permanent seats. But Europe, with 450 million people, has 2 permanent members, France and the UK, plus massive influence through the European Union. So when people act surprised at how South Africa is pushing back about how global institutions are structured, I mean, are we really surprised? Now, let's talk about the G20, because here is where it gets interesting. Now, the G20 was created in 1999 as a forum for the world's major economies to coordinate on financial crisis and economic policy. By 2008, it was elevated to a leaders' summit, the premier forum for international economic cooperation. 20 members, right? The biggest economies: the United States, China, Japan, Germany, India. You get it. But here is the twist. The European Union sits at the table as its own member, in addition to France, Germany and Italy, who are already there as individual countries. So Europe effectively has 4 seats, the EU as a bloc, plus 3 member states. Africa, until 2023, had just 1 seat, South Africa. And for years, African leaders said, Hold on. If the EU can sit as supranational entity, why can't the African Union? Now, guess what happened when they pushed for it? Resistance, debate, pushback. But in 2023, something shifted. India held the G20 presidency and they championed what they called a Global South agenda. And part of that was getting the African Union admitted as a permanent member. So finally, after years of lobbying, led heavily by South Africa, the African Union was welcomed in. And that set the stage for what happens next, because in 2025, South Africa took the G20 presidency and they decided to do something bold. They invited 42 countries and organizations to the summit in Johannesburg. Not just the usual 20 members, 42 guests. African nations that had never been at the G20 table, Caribbean states, Pacific Island nations, civil society groups. Ramaphosa said the quiet part out loud.
From the outset of South Africa's G20 presidency, we said that this would be an African presidency. We said that we would strive to bring the priorities of our continent, Africa, to the center of global dialogue.
Now, how do you think Washington reacted to that? Now, senior US officials of the Trump's administration did not hold back. They called South Africa's summit the G100. Now, the G100, as in you have invited so many people. This isn't a focused forum anymore, it's a circus. One American official said they were whittling the G20 back to basics and making it work for the American people better than ever. Translation: we want a smaller table, fewer voices, more control. And then Washington made it official. They downgraded their attendance. Senior US officials skipped key G20 meetings in Johannesburg. Now, here is what fascinates me, because this isn't really about guest lists. This is about power, about who gets to define legitimacy. Now, think about it. For decades, the West has championed multilateralism and the rules-based international order. But the moment those institutions start to include voices that might challenge Western priorities, suddenly conversations shift to efficiency, keeping the forum functional. And Ramaphosa saw right through it.
And it basically means that there should be no bullying of one nation by another nation. We are all equal.
Now, look, I get why some people are nervous about expanding the G20. More voices can mean slower decisions, harder compromises, less predictability. But here is the counter-argument. If a forum that claims to represent the global economy doesn't actually reflect global demographics or economic realities, how long before it becomes irrelevant? Because Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, they have options now. BRICS is expanding, regional trade blocs are gaining power. The Global South is coordinating more than it ever has. And that brings us to the real chess match here. So South Africa isn't just hosting a summit, they are running a coordinated strategy across multiple platforms. Layer 1. The G20 used the presidency to push African priorities: debt relief, climate finance, critical minerals, energy transition. Layer 2. The African Union Now, a permanent G20 member, the African Union can represent 55 African countries, not just South Africa. 3. BRICS. South Africa uses its position in BRICS alongside Brazil, Russia, India, China, and now expanded members to amplify global South voices and push back against Western-dominated financial systems. Now, this is what I mean by chess, not checkers, because while Washington is focused on shrinking the G20 table, Pretoria is building alternative tables and linking them. Now, here is where it gets even more layered. South Africa's presidency focused on 4 main priorities. The first one is disaster resilience, and this is very important because climate change hits Africa hardest, but Africa contributes the least to it. The second one is debt sustainability. Many African countries are drowning in debt to Western creditors and Chinese lenders. Third, just energy transition. How do you move to green energy without destroying jobs and industries? And fourth, critical minerals. Africa has the lithium, cobalt and rare earths the world needs for batteries and tech. But right now they export raw materials and import finished products. The goal, move up the value chain, process those minerals in Africa, build factories in Africa, create jobs in Africa, and use platforms like the G20 to force global powers to support that transition, or at least stop blocking it. But here is the uncomfortable question no one wants to ask out loud. What if Africa succeeds? What if the AU becomes the real power broker in the G20? What if African countries start coordinating through BRICS and AU structures to determine better terms on everything from debt to trade to climate finance? Who loses to that scenario? So, where does this leave us? The G20 summit happened. Ramaphosa gave his speeches. The US stayed largely on the sidelines. The African Union sat at the table for the first time as a permanent member. But here is the thing. This story isn't over. Because the real question isn't whether South Africa hosted a successful summit. The real question is whether this moment marks a turning point or just another symbolic gesture that fades into history. Will the African Union use its seat to actually reshape G20 agendas? Or will it get sidelined in backroom deals with the US, China and Europe? Will African countries leverage BRICS, the G20, and regional blocs to secure better terms on debt and trade? Or will great power competition pull them into choosing sides? Now, here is the part that keeps me up at night. If the West keeps treating inclusive multilateralism as a threat, if every time the global South tries to broaden the table, they get mocked or sidelined, what comes next? Because you can't keep 1.4 billion people, soon to be 2.5 billion, outside the room forever. Eventually they'll build their own room, and maybe that's already happening. So here is my question for you. Do you think South Africa's expanded G20 summit was a breakthrough or just theater? Is this the moment Africa finally started rewriting the rules? Or are we watching the same old patterns play out with different branding? Drop your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you want to understand how power really moves across Africa and the world, not just the headlines but the strategies underneath, hit subscribe, because this is just one move in a much bigger game. I'm Asongwe Luis. You're watching Africa Today, and this is a strategic lens. I want to say thank you to my members. we always shout out to our members immediately after the video. So if you haven't joined our membership, please hit the join button, and the link to join in that membership is right at the comment section. Pinned comments. Thank you. See you in my next investigation. Bye.